The charred remains of St. Mary's Chapel stood like broken teeth against the Montana sky, smoke still rising from the blackened timbers that had once sheltered 3 generations of weddings, christenings, and final farewells. But it wasn't the destruction that made Emma Sullivan's heart stop as she stepped off the westbound train. It was the tall, weathered man waiting on the platform, his hands moving in fluid, silent gestures she somehow understood without ever having learned. He wasn't the groom she'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train's whistle had been Emma Sullivan's companion for 6 days, its mournful cry echoing across endless plains that stretched from Pennsylvania to the Montana Territory. Each mile, clickety-clack beneath the wheels, carried her further from the suffocating certainty of spinsterhood and closer to a future she could barely allow herself to imagine. A husband who had promised in carefully written letters to accept her exactly as she was, stutter and all. Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape transform from crowded eastern cities to vast open spaces that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Her reflection stared back, auburn hair severely pinned beneath a modest traveling hat, green eyes that held too much hope for a woman of 28, and lips that had struggled with words since childhood but had never struggled with dreams. The worn carpetbag at her feet contained everything she owned: 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of the parents she'd lost to consumption, and most precious of all, the packet of 17 letters from Pastor Samuel Mitchell of Millfield, Montana, letters that had arrived like lifelines during the darkest period of her life, when her position as a seamstress in the textile mill had been eliminated and her landlord had made it clear that a woman alone was no longer welcome in his boarding house. Samuel Mitchell's first letter had been a response to her carefully worded advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Respectable woman, 28, skilled in domestic arts, seeks correspondence with gentlemen of good character for purpose of matrimony. Speech impediment no barrier to devotion or industry. Most men, she knew, would have discarded such honesty immediately. Who wanted a wife who stumbled over words, who turned red-faced when forced to speak in company, who had been dismissed from 3 positions because customers complained they couldn't understand her when she tried to assist them? But Samuel Mitchell had written back within a week, his penmanship careful and kind. Dear Miss Sullivan, I am moved by your candor and impressed by your courage in seeking a new life despite challenges that would daunt many. As a man of God, I have learned that true communication comes from the heart, not merely the tongue. I would be honored to continue our correspondence if you are willing. What followed had been 6 months of letters that revealed a man unlike any Emma had ever encountered. Samuel wrote of his small church in Millfield, a growing town nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, where copper mines and cattle ranches supported a community of hard-working families. He described Sunday services where children fidgeted in wooden pews, while their parents listened to sermons about forgiveness and second chances. He wrote of his vegetable garden behind the parsonage, of the library he was building for the town's children, of his dream to establish a school where learning mattered more than perfect speech. I have known since childhood what it means to be different, he had written in his 7th letter. Though my challenge is not with speech but with hearing, I lost much of it to scarlet fever at age 12. I've learned to read lips and to communicate through gestures that some in my congregation have begun to learn as well. Perhaps together we might prove that love finds ways to bridge any gap between souls. The revelation that her intended husband was partially deaf had not deterred Emma. It had filled her with hope. Here was a man who understood struggle, who had found ways to serve others despite his limitations, who saw differences as qualities to be worked with rather than obstacles, to be overcome. By his 15th letter, Samuel had begun making concrete plans for their life together. The parsonage had a sitting room that received excellent morning light, perfect for the sewing work Emma could take in to supplement his modest pastoral salary. The town's women, he wrote, were practical souls who cared more about skilled needlework than perfect pronunciation when placing orders for mending and alterations. "Millfield needs what you have to offer," he had assured her, "not just your skills with needle and thread, but your gentle spirit and your understanding of what it means to persevere through difficulties. I believe you would find acceptance here that perhaps has been denied elsewhere." His 16th letter had contained a train ticket and detailed instructions for the journey west, along with a confession that had made Emma's heart race. "I find myself counting days until your arrival, not from duty or loneliness, but from genuine affection that has grown through our correspondence. I pray that when we meet, you will find me worthy of the trust you have placed in my promises." The final letter, received just 3 days before her departure, had been brief but filled with excitement. "The preparations for our wedding are complete. St. Mary's Chapel has been reserved for Saturday afternoon, and Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile has kindly offered to provide flowers from her garden. I have spoken with the congregation about your speech difficulties, and they are eager to welcome you with the patience and understanding you deserve. Come quickly, dear Emma. Your new life awaits." Now, as the train began its descent toward Millfield, Emma clutched that final letter and tried to calm the butterflies that had taken residence in her stomach. Through the window, she could see the town emerging from the valley floor, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, with the silver thread of a river running alongside and mountains rising like protective walls on all sides. The train's brakes squealed as they approached the modest platform where a small crowd had gathered to meet the afternoon arrival. Emma gathered her belongings with practiced efficiency, her movements betraying none of the anxiety that had been building since crossing into Montana territory. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, imagining how she would greet Samuel Mitchell, how she would manage the introductions to his parishioners, how she would navigate the first crucial hours in a place that would either become her sanctuary or another source of rejection. What she hadn't prepared for was the sight that greeted her as she stepped onto the platform. Where St. Mary's Chapel should have stood at the end of Main Street, only blackened ruins remained. Charred timber beams pointed skyward like accusing fingers, and wisps of smoke still rose from the wreckage, suggesting the fire had been recent, perhaps only hours old. But it was the man approaching her that caused Emma's carefully prepared words to die in her throat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with prematurely grey hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors rather than in a pulpit. His clothes were those of a working man: flannel shirt, worn denim pants, and boots that had seen hard use. Most startling of all were his hands, which moved in fluid, purposeful gestures even as he walked toward her. "Miss Sullivan?" The voice was deep and hesitant, carrying an accent she couldn't place. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice to cooperate. At such a crucial moment, the man removed his hat, revealing more of the grey hair that seemed premature for someone who appeared to be in his 40s. "I'm afraid there's been some terrible news, miss. My name is Jacob Mitchell. Samuel was my nephew." The past tense hit Emma like a physical blow. Was. She felt the blood drain from her face as the implications became clear. Was. She managed, her stutter making the single word sound like a broken whisper. Jacob Mitchell's weathered face creased with genuine sorrow. "There was a fire last night, Miss Sullivan. The church. And Samuel was inside, preparing for—" He gestured helplessly toward the ruins. "For your wedding. He didn't make it out. The platform seemed to tilt beneath Emma's feet. Everything she had planned, everything she had sacrificed to make this journey possible, crumbled in an instant. Her meager savings had been exhausted by the train fare. Her position at the textile mill had been filled by another woman. The room she had rented in Philadelphia was now occupied by someone else. She had burned every bridge to reach this moment, and now she stood stranded in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money for a week's lodging, mourning a man she had never met but had grown to love through carefully written words. I see, she finally managed, though the words felt hollow and inadequate. Her stutter seemed worse in her distress, making even simple responses a struggle. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Mitchell." Jacob studied her face with an intensity that made Emma uncomfortable, his brown eyes reflecting what appeared to be not just grief, but deep concern for her situation. As he watched her struggle with words, his hands began moving in those fluid gestures again. And somehow, impossibly, Emma found herself understanding their meaning. "Are you all right?" his hands asked. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Emma stared at him in wonder and confusion. She had never learned sign language, had never seen it used except in glimpses at charity events for the deaf. Yet something about his movements, the expression on his face, the context of their situation, made his meaning clear. I don't know how I understood that," she whispered. Jacob's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You read signs?" Emma shook her head. Never learned, but somehow." Yes. For the first time since delivering his devastating news, Jacob Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "Samuel always said some people had a gift for it. Maybe—" He paused, studying her more intently. "Maybe that's why he felt you two would understand each other so well." The mention of Samuel's faith in their compatibility brought fresh pain to Emma's chest. She looked again at the burned ruins of the church, trying to imagine the man who had died there, preparing for a wedding that would never happen. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the bustle of other passengers being greeted by their families. Jacob glanced around the platform, then back at Emma with what appeared to be genuine concern mixed with something else, a kind of determined resolve that reminded her somehow of Samuel's letters. "Now," he said carefully, "we figure out how to honor Samuel's promises, even though he's not here to keep them himself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The Millfield Hotel stood 3 stories tall at the corner of Main Street and Copper Avenue, its weathered clapboard siding painted a faded yellow that had once been cheerful but now spoke of a town that had seen better days. Emma followed Jacob Mitchell up the front steps, her carpet bag feeling heavier with each step, not from its modest contents, but from the weight of uncertainty that had settled on her shoulders like a lead shawl. The hotel lobby was sparse, but clean, furnished with mismatched chairs that suggested practicality over comfort. Behind the registration desk, a woman in her 50s looked up from her ledger, her steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, and intelligent blue eyes that took in Emma's appearance with professional assessment. "Jacob Mitchell," the woman said with obvious familiarity, then noticed Emma and modulated her tone. "And you must be the young lady Samuel was expecting." Her voice carried genuine sympathy. "I'm Sarah Whitman. I run this establishment, and I want you to know how sorry I am about what happened." Emma managed a nod, not trusting her voice in this crucial first interaction with someone who would undoubtedly judge her fitness for the community based on these initial moments. Jacob stepped forward, his weathered hands moving in quick, fluid gestures as he spoke. "Mrs. Whitman, Miss Sullivan needs a room while we sort things out. She's had quite a shock." Emma watched, fascinated, as Mrs. Whitman's eyes followed Jacob's hand movements with obvious comprehension. The hotel proprietor could read sign language as naturally as she could read the printed page. "Of course," Mrs. Whitman replied, both speaking and signing simultaneously. "Room 7 on the second floor has the best light and the quietest location. How long will you be staying, dear?" The question Emma had been dreading forced her to confront the harsh reality of her situation. "I'm not certain," she admitted, her stutter making the words come out in broken syllables. Perhaps a few days while I make our arrangements." Mrs. Whitman's expression softened at the sound of Emma's struggle with speech, but there was no pity in her eyes, only the practical kindness of someone who had dealt with all manner of travelers in difficult circumstances. "The rate is 50 cents per day, including breakfast and supper," Mrs. Whitman said gently. "Payment can be arranged as needed." Emma opened her small purse and counted out $3, leaving her with less than $2 to her name. The transaction felt like signing her own death warrant, committing her to a course of action she had not yet determined. As Mrs. Whitman prepared the room key, Jacob lingered beside Emma, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, he accompanied his words with signs, a habit that seemed as natural as breathing. "Miss Sullivan, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I believe Samuel would want me to ensure your welfare during this difficult time. Perhaps tomorrow we might discuss the situation more thoroughly." Emma looked up at him sharply. "What sort of discussion, Mr. Mitchell?" Jacob glanced around the lobby, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard, then spoke quietly while his hands continued their fluid movements. "Samuel spoke of you often in recent weeks, Miss Sullivan. He shared your letters with me, not the private parts, you understand, but your descriptions of your work, your hopes for establishing yourself professionally. He was quite taken with your spirit and determination." The mention of Samuel's sharing her letters brought heat to Emma's cheeks. She had written honestly about her struggles, her dismissals from various positions due to employers' impatience with her speech difficulties, her dreams of finding a place where her skills mattered more than her impediment. "That's very kind of you to consider, Mr. Mitchell, but I can't simply assume ownership of our arrangements made for a marriage that never occurred." Jacob's weathered face creased with something that might have been a smile. "Actually, Miss Sullivan, the legal situation might be more complex than you realize. Samuel made certain preparations for your arrival that extend beyond the personal arrangements." Before Emma could ask what he meant, the hotel door opened to admit two women, who immediately commanded attention through their bearing and dress. The first was perhaps 40 years old, with blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style that suggested both wealth and vanity. Her companion was younger, maybe 30, with dark hair and sharp features that spoke of intelligence and calculation. The blonde woman's gaze fell immediately on Emma, and her expression shifted from casual interest to something approaching hostility. "Jacob Mitchell," she said coldly, ignoring Emma entirely. "I heard you met someone at the train station. I assume this is the woman poor Samuel was planning to marry." Jacob straightened to his full height, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Phillips, this is Miss Emma Sullivan. She's traveled a considerable distance based on commitments Samuel made, and she deserves our courtesy and support during this difficult time." Mrs. Hartwell's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Commitments? Samuel is dead, Jacob. Whatever romantic notions he entertained died with him in that fire." Emma felt the familiar burn of shame and anger that had plagued her throughout her adult life when people spoke about her as if she weren't present. But before she could attempt a response, Jacob's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Samuel's commitments weren't merely romantic, Mrs. Hartwell. They were legal and financial arrangements that don't simply disappear because of his death." Miss Phillips, the dark-haired woman, stepped forward with obvious interest. "What sort of arrangements, Jacobs?" Hands moved in quick, sharp gestures that Emma somehow understood meant, "Not here, not now." Aloud, he said, "That's a private matter to be discussed with Miss Sullivan and the appropriate legal authorities." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes narrowed dangerously. Legal authorities? Jacob, surely you're not suggesting that this woman has any claim on Samuel's estate or property? She never even met him. "What I'm suggesting," Jacob replied with carefully controlled calm, "is that Samuel was a man of his word who made specific provisions for Miss Sullivan's future. Those provisions deserve to be honored regardless of the tragic circumstances that have intervened." Emma watched this exchange with growing confusion and apprehension. What provisions could Samuel have made? Their correspondence had focused on personal compatibility and future dreams, not legal arrangements or financial commitments. Mrs. Hartwell turned her attention directly to Emma for the first time, her gaze sharp and calculating. "Miss Sullivan, I'm sure you're a perfectly respectable woman, but you must understand that Millfield has certain standards to maintain. A woman who travels across the country to marry a stranger she's never met, well, it raises questions about judgment and character." The attack was subtle, but unmistakable, designed to establish Emma as an outsider whose presence was both unwelcome and inappropriate. Emma felt her face flush with the familiar combination of anger and humiliation that had driven her from Philadelphia. "In the first place, I came here at Samuel's invitation," Emma managed, her stutter making her response sound defensive rather than dignified. "He knew of my speech difficulties and accepted them." Miss Phillips seized on the admission like a predator scenting weakness. "Speech difficulties? How interesting. I imagine that would make it quite challenging to participate in normal social interactions or business dealings." The implication was clear. A woman who couldn't speak properly couldn't function effectively in their community. Emma had heard similar assessments countless times, from employers who found her stutter inconvenient, from landlords who preferred tenants who could communicate normally with their neighbors, from potential suitors who disappeared after their first conversation. But Jacob Mitchell's response surprised everyone present. Without speaking, he moved his hands in a series of fluid, expressive gestures. Emma found herself understanding his meaning with startling clarity. True communication comes from the heart and mind, not from perfect speech. Those who judge others by such shallow standards reveal their own limitations. Mrs. Whitman, who had been quietly observing the exchange, while preparing Emma's room key, nodded approvingly at Jacob's signed comment. "Exactly right," she said aloud. "I've known plenty of people who spoke beautifully, but had nothing worthwhile to say." Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed with indignation at the implied criticism. "Mrs. Whitman, surely you understand the importance of maintaining community standards. We can't have just anyone settling here and claiming respectability simply because they've managed to entrap a grieving widower into ill-considered promises." "Entrap?" Emma's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "I never entrapped anyone. Samuel, who wrote to me first, continued our correspondence for me months and invited me to come here as his intended wife. And now he's conveniently dead," Miss Phillips observed with cruel calculation, "leaving you free to make claims on his property and resources without having to fulfill your part of any bargain." The accusation hit Emma like a physical blow. These women were suggesting that she had somehow benefited from Samuel's death, that his tragic end represented an opportunity rather than a devastating loss. Before Emma could attempt a response, Jacob stepped between her and her accusers, his weathered face dark with anger. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying dangerous quiet. "Miss Sullivan has just learned of a terrible tragedy. She's grieving a man she never got to meet but had grown to care for through months of correspondence. Your insinuations are not only cruel, but completely unfounded." Mrs. Hartwell smiled with cold satisfaction. Grieving. She met him through a newspaper advertisement, Jacob. Hardly the foundation for genuine affection. Marriage advertisements are a respectable way for people in different circumstances to find suitable partners, Mrs. Whitman interjected firmly. Half the marriages in Montana Territory began that way, including several right here in Millfield. Perhaps, Miss Phillips conceded, but that doesn't change the fundamental problem. This woman has no family here, no connections, no social standing, even if Samuel made certain promises. Surely those died with him. Jacob's hands moved in sharp, angry gestures while he spoke. Samuel's promises were witnessed and documented, Miss Phillips. They won't simply disappear because you find Miss Sullivan's presence inconvenient. Documented how? Mrs. Hartwell demanded. That, Jacob replied with finality, is a matter for Miss Sullivan and I to discuss privately. As the two women departed, with obvious reluctance, Emma felt the weight of hostility that would make her life in Millfield exponentially more difficult than Samuel's letters had suggested. These weren't just unfriendly neighbors, they were actively opposed to her presence and would work to make her integration into the community impossible. Mrs. Whitman handed Emma the room key with a sympathetic smile. Don't let them discourage you, dear. Not everyone in Millfield shares their narrow-minded attitudes. As Emma climbed the stairs to her room, she heard Jacob speaking quietly with Mrs. Whitman below, their conversation punctuated by hand gestures she could no longer see. Whatever arrangements Samuel had made, whatever legal provisions Jacob had mentioned, her future in this town would clearly depend on more than documentation and legal technicalities. She would have to prove herself worthy of acceptance in a community where some had already decided she didn't belong. Emma's room at the Millfield Hotel was modest but comfortable, with a brass bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a single window that looked out over the town's main thoroughfare toward the blackened remains of St. Mary's Chapel. She sat on the edge of the bed as dawn light crept through the thin curtains. Samuel's letters spread before her like pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Reading them again with new knowledge of his death, Emma noticed details that had seemed merely considerate but now appeared deliberately calculated. In his 9th letter, Samuel had written, "I have spoken with several ladies in town about your skills with needle and thread. Mrs. Peterson, who runs the general store, is quite excited about the possibility of offering quality seamstress services to our growing community." His 13th letter had been even more specific. "I've taken the liberty of arranging workspace in the building behind Murphy's carpentry shop. The light is excellent, and there's room for both sewing and consultations. I hope you don't mind. My presumption, but I wanted everything ready for your arrival, so you could begin establishing yourself immediately." Emma had interpreted these preparations as thoughtful wedding gifts, but now she wondered if Samuel had been planning something more permanent and independent than a simple marriage arrangement. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. "Miss Sullivan?" Jacob's voice called through the door. "I brought breakfast and wondered if we might discuss those arrangements I mentioned yesterday." Emma opened the door to find Jacob holding a tray with coffee, eggs, and fresh bread from the hotel's kitchen. Behind him stood a woman she hadn't met, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and kind brown eyes that radiated intelligence and warmth. "This is Mrs. Margaret Peterson," Jacob said, his hands moving in accompanying gestures. "She owns Peterson's General Store and corresponded with Samuel about your business prospects." Mrs. Peterson stepped forward with a welcoming smile. "Miss Sullivan, I'm so sorry for your loss. Samuel spoke of you with such genuine affection and respect. He was quite proud of your accomplishments as a seamstress." Emma accepted the tray gratefully, her stomach reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the previous morning on the train. Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Peterson. I'm afraid I don't fully understand what arrangements Samuel made." Mrs. Peterson settled into the room's single chair while Jacob remained standing, his weathered hands continuing their fluid movements as he spoke. "Samuel didn't just plan a wedding, Miss Sullivan. He planned a future for you that would remain secure, regardless of what happened to him personally." "What do you mean?" Jacob reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document, its official seals and careful penmanship immediately identifying it as a legal instrument. 3 months ago, Samuel established what he called the Millfield Women's Trade Cooperative. It's a formal business entity designed to support women in establishing independent livelihoods. Emma stared at the document, trying to understand its implications. "A cooperative?" Mrs. Peterson leaned forward eagerly. "It's brilliant, really. Instead of individual women struggling alone to establish businesses, the cooperative provides shared resources, mutual support, and legal protection. Samuel funded the initial investment and created a structure that would continue operating even if something happened to him. And you're listed as the primary seamstress and founding member," Jacob added, his sign language emphasizing the significance of her position. "Samuel registered your name and qualifications with the Territorial Business Office 6 weeks ago." The revelation left Emma speechless. Samuel had not only prepared for their marriage, he had prepared for her success as an independent businesswoman, creating legal frameworks that would protect her interests regardless of their personal relationship. But surely his death changes everything, Emma managed. "I can't simply claim ownership of arrangements made for someone else's benefit." Mrs. Peterson exchanged meaningful glances with Jacob before responding. "Actually, dear, the cooperative's charter specifically states that founding members' rights are individual and permanent, not dependent on external relationships or circumstances. Samuel designed it that way deliberately." Jacob nodded, his hands moving in emphatic gestures. "He told me he wanted to ensure that your professional future couldn't be destroyed by personal tragedy or social prejudice. The cooperative gives you legal standing that no one can challenge." A sharp knock interrupted their conversation. Through the thin door, Emma could hear Mrs. Hartwell's imperious voice. "Miss Sullivan, we need to speak with you immediately. There are matters concerning Samuel's estate that require clarification." Jacob's expression darkened as he moved toward the door. "She's not alone," he called back. "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of witnesses." When Jacob opened the door, Mrs. Hartwell entered with 2 men Emma hadn't met. One elderly, with expensive clothing that suggested wealth and authority. The other middle-aged, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone accustomed to enforcing others' decisions. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Hartwell said without preamble, "this is Judge Robert Sterling from the Territorial Court and Marshal Tom Bradford. They've come to investigate irregularities concerning Samuel's estate and certain claims that have been made regarding your status here." Emma felt her stomach drop as she grasped the implications. These people weren't just unfriendly neighbors. They were using legal authority to challenge her right to remain in Millfield. Judge Sterling, a man in his 70s with silver hair and calculating eyes, cleared his throat officiously. "Miss Sullivan, there are questions about your relationship with the deceased and any claims you might have made regarding his property or business arrangements." "I've made no claims," Emma replied, her stutter making her sound defensive despite her attempts to remain calm. "I came here to marry Samuel, not to inherit anything." Marshal Bradford, a weathered man who looked uncomfortable with his role in the confrontation, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we've received complaints alleging that you might be making false claims about business partnerships or legal arrangements that didn't actually exist." The accusation was carefully worded but devastating in its implications. They were suggesting that Emma was lying about Samuel's preparations, that she was attempting to defraud his estate by claiming arrangements that had never been made. Jacob straightened to his full height, his hands moving in sharp, angry gestures. while he spoke. "Marshal Bradford, Judge Sterling, if you're going to make accusations, you'd better have evidence to support them. Miss Sullivan has done nothing but arrive on a train ticket Samuel Mitchell purchased for her." "Evidence is exactly what we're here to examine," Judge Sterling replied coolly, producing a folder from his briefcase. "We need to see any documentation Miss Sullivan possesses regarding business arrangements or financial commitments allegedly made by the deceased." Mrs. Peterson rose from her chair, her matronly appearance belying the steel in her voice. "Your Honor, I hope you're not allowing personal prejudices to interfere with proper legal procedures. Miss Sullivan's relationship with Samuel was conducted through honest correspondence over many months." "Nevertheless," Mrs. Hartwell interjected smoothly, "a woman who arrives in town claiming marriage rights to a dead man might be expected to produce extraordinary evidence of such arrangements. The attack was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. By framing Emma's presence as suspicious from the outset, they had created a situation where she would be required to prove her innocence rather than they to prove her guilt." "I have Samuel's letters," Emma said quietly, gesturing toward the papers spread on her bed. 17 of them, describing our correspondence and his preparations for our marriage." Judge Sterling examined the letters with professional skepticism, his weathered face revealing nothing about his assessment of their authenticity or significance. "Personal correspondence is not the same as legal documentation, Miss Sullivan. These letters speak of wedding plans and personal affection, but they don't establish any formal business relationships or financial obligations." Emma's heart sank as she realized the trap that had been carefully prepared. Samuel's letters focused on their personal relationship and his excitement about their future together. The business arrangements he had mentioned were described as gifts and preparations rather than formal commitments. But Jacob stepped forward, his expression calm, despite the obvious tension in the room. "Actually, Your Honor, the business documentation is quite separate from the personal correspondence." He produced the cooperative charter Emma had seen earlier, along with additional papers she hadn't examined. The Millfield Women's Trade Cooperative was properly registered with territorial authorities 3 months ago. Miss Sullivan's membership and professional qualifications are formally documented and legally binding. Judge Sterling accepted the papers with obvious surprise, his confident demeanor shifting to careful scrutiny as he examined the official seals and legal language. "This appears to be quite comprehensive," he admitted reluctantly. Mrs. Peterson moved to stand beside Emma, her presence offering moral support and social credibility. "Samuel consulted with me extensively about the cooperative structure, Your Honor. He wanted to ensure that women in our community would have proper legal protection when establishing businesses." "Protection from what?" Marshal Bradford asked, though his question seemed directed more at understanding than challenge. "From exactly this sort of harassment," Jacob replied pointedly, his sign language adding emphasis to his spoken words. "From people who use social prejudice and legal intimidation to prevent others from exercising legitimate rights." Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed with indignation. "Harassment? We're simply ensuring that proper legal procedures are followed to protect community interests." "Whose interests?" Mrs. Peterson asked sharply. "Because the cooperative benefits every family in Millfield who needs quality seamstress services, which currently means traveling to Helena or paying exorbitant prices for inferior work." Judge Sterling continued examining the cooperative documents, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "These papers appear to be in order," he said finally. "Miss Sullivan's membership in the cooperative is properly documented and legally binding regardless of her personal relationship with the founder." The admission sent a ripple of shock through Mrs. Hartwell's faction. Their carefully planned legal challenge was crumbling before their eyes, revealed as harassment rather than legitimate concern for community welfare. "Furthermore," Judge Sterling continued, The cooperative's charter includes provisions that specifically protect members from discriminatory treatment based on personal circumstances or social standing. Any attempts to interfere with Miss Sullivan's legal rights could constitute violations of territorial law. Emma stared at the judge in amazement. Samuel had not only prepared for their marriage, he had prepared for her protection against exactly the sort of opposition she was now facing. Marshal Bradford looked increasingly uncomfortable with his role in what was clearly revealed as social persecution rather than legitimate law enforcement. "Ma'am," he said to Emma, "I apologize for any distress this investigation has caused. Based on the documentation presented, you appear to have every legal right to establish yourself in Millfield." As the officials prepared to leave, Mrs. Hartwell made one final attempt to salvage her position. "Legal rights are one thing, Miss Sullivan, but social acceptance is quite another. You may have papers that protect your business interests, but you can't legislate respectability or community approval." Emma looked at the woman who had tried to destroy her future before it could begin, feeling not anger, but pity for someone whose world was so small that a struggling seamstress represented a threat. "Mrs. Hartwell," Emma said clearly, her stutter almost completely absent in her moment of triumph, "I didn't come to Millfield seeking your approval. I came seeking the opportunity to build something meaningful with my own skills and determination." Samuel understood that difference, even if you cannot. As the room emptied of antagonists and officials, Emma found herself alone with her unexpected allies, holding legal documents that represented not just protection, but genuine opportunity in a community where at least some people valued substance over superficial judgments. The building behind Murphy's carpentry shop had once housed a blacksmith's forge, its stone walls and high ceiling designed to contain heat and sparks from metalwork. Now, as Emma stepped through the heavy wooden door that Jacob had unlocked with a key Samuel had left in his possession, she gasped at the transformation that greeted her. Sunlight streamed through newly installed windows, illuminating a space that had been carefully converted into a seamstress's dream workshop. Long wooden tables stood at precisely the right height for cutting fabric, their surfaces smooth and unmarked. Built-in shelving lined one wall, ready to hold bolts of material and supplies. Most remarkable of all was the Singer sewing machine, positioned near the largest window, a professional model that would have cost more than Emma earned in 6 months at the textile mill. "Samuel ordered it from Chicago," Jacob explained, his hands moving in the fluid gestures that had become natural between them. "Had it shipped by rail and freight wagon. Took nearly 2 months to arrive." Mrs. Peterson, who had accompanied them to examine the workshop, ran her fingers along one of the cutting tables with obvious appreciation. "He consulted with me about every detail, asked what equipment would be most useful, what supplies were hardest to obtain locally, how to arrange the workspace for maximum efficiency." Emma moved through the space like someone exploring a palace designed specifically for her use. Everything she had dreamed of having during her years of working in cramped boarding house rooms was here. Proper lighting, adequate space, professional equipment, even a comfortable chair for detailed handwork. "There's more," Jacob said, leading her to a wooden crate she hadn't noticed. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled paper, were bolts of fabric in qualities and colors she had never seen outside the finest shops in Philadelphia. Silk, wool, cotton and linen in shades from deep burgundy to pale cream, enough material to create garments for dozens of customers. "How did he afford all this?" Emma asked in wonder. "A pastor's salary couldn't possibly cover such expenses." Jacob's expression grew more serious. "Samuel inherited money from our grandfather. Not a fortune, but enough to invest in something he believed would make a real difference. He chose to invest in your future because he believed you could build something important here." Mrs. Peterson opened another crate, revealing spools of thread in every conceivable color, buttons made from horn and mother-of-pearl, ribbons and laces that would have been prohibitively expensive to purchase individually. He corresponded with suppliers in Chicago, St. Louis, even New York, wanted to ensure you'd have access to materials that would let you create truly sophisticated garments. The magnitude of Samuel's investment became clear as Emma continued exploring. Beyond the equipment and materials, he had commissioned custom-built storage solutions, purchased specialized tools for delicate work, even arranged for a small, wood-burning stove that would keep the workshop comfortable during Montana's harsh winters. "I don't understand," Emma said, overwhelmed by the scope of his preparations. "This represents months of planning and considerable expense. Why would Samuel commit so much without being certain I would accept his proposal?" Jacob moved to the largest window, gazing out at the mountains that rose beyond Millfield's cluster of buildings. When he spoke, his hands gestured toward the peaks as if drawing strength from their permanence. Samuel lost his first wife to consumption 3 years ago. Martha was everything to him. When she died, he couldn't bear to remain in the parsonage they had shared, couldn't stand conducting services in the church where they'd been married. Emma felt her heart constrict at the pain in Jacob's voice. Samuel had never mentioned a previous marriage in his letters, though she now understood why he had written with such empathy about loss and new beginnings. "He came to live with me for nearly a year," Jacob continued, his signs becoming more expressive as emotion deepened his words. "Couldn't bring himself to preach about hope when his own had been destroyed. I thought he might never recover his faith or his purpose." Mrs. Peterson nodded sadly. The whole town worried about him. Samuel had always been such a source of strength for others, but Martha's death nearly broke his spirit completely. "What changed?" Emma asked softly. Jacob turned back to face her, his weathered features softening with memory. "Your first letter. When he read your advertisement in that Philadelphia paper, something awakened in him that had been dormant since Martha's death. Not just romantic interest, but purpose. He began to see possibilities again." "He spent weeks composing his response to your advertisement," Mrs. Peterson added. "Wanted every word to be perfect, to convey not just his own situation, but his genuine interest in your welfare and happiness." Emma thought of Samuel's first letter with its careful penmanship and thoughtful consideration of her difficulties. She had been touched by his acceptance of her speech impediment, but now she understood that his compassion came from personal experience with struggle and loss. "The business preparations weren't just wedding gifts," Jacob continued, his hands emphasizing the importance of his words. "They were Samuel's way of ensuring that you would have genuine independence and security, regardless of what happened. To him personally, he had learned that life is unpredictable, and he wanted to give you the tools to build a future that couldn't be destroyed by circumstances beyond your control." The revelation transformed Emma's understanding of everything she had discovered in Millfield. Samuel's preparations hadn't been the romantic gestures of an infatuated man, but the careful planning of someone who understood vulnerability and wanted to provide real protection against it. A knock at the workshop door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Peterson opened it to reveal a young woman Emma hadn't met, perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and hope. "Mrs. Peterson," the newcomer said hesitantly, "I heard there might be a seamstress available for work. I'm Kate Morrison from the Morrison Ranch, about 10 miles south of town." Mrs. Peterson smiled warmly. "Perfect timing, Kate. Miss Sullivan, I'd like you to meet your first potential customer." Kate Morrison stepped into the workshop, her eyes widening as she took in the professional setup and quality materials. "Oh my," she breathed, "this is far more sophisticated than anything we have access to locally." Emma felt a flutter of nervousness as she faced her first real test as an independent businesswoman in Millfield. "What sort of work do you need, Miss Morrison?" Kate's expression showed no reaction to Emma's stutter, suggesting either natural courtesy or experience with speech. Difficulties. I'm getting married in 2 months and I need a wedding dress that's suitable for a ranch wedding, but elegant enough for the occasion. Do you have fabric preferences? Emma asked, her professional instincts overcoming her nervousness as she began to envision possibilities. Kate produced a piece of ivory silk from her bag. I inherited this from my grandmother, but I've never had it made into anything because the seamstresses in Helena charge more than we can afford, and their designs are either too elaborate for ranch life or too plain for a wedding. Emma accepted the silk with reverence, her trained eye immediately recognizing its exceptional quality and the possibilities it represented. The fabric was exquisite enough to create a gown worthy of any city cathedral, yet she could envision designs that would be practical for an outdoor Montana wedding. This is beautiful silk, Emma said, her stutter less noticeable as she focused on professional matters. I can create something that honors its quality while being suitable for your needs and lifestyle. Kate's face lit up with excitement. Really? You could work with what I have rather than insisting I purchase everything new? Of course, Emma replied, surprised by the question. Good design works with what the customer brings, not just what the seamstress wants to sell. Jacob and Mrs. Peterson exchanged meaningful glances, clearly recognizing that Emma was demonstrating exactly the approach Samuel had hoped she would bring to Millfield, practical skill combined with genuine consideration for her customers' needs and circumstances. What would you charge for such work? Kate asked carefully, clearly prepared for disappointing news. Emma considered the question, thinking not just about her own needs, but about establishing herself as accessible to the working families who made up most of Millfield's population. For a wedding dress, using your own fabric, with FE fittings and alterations included, I would charge $8. Kate stared at her in amazement. $8? The seamstresses in Helena quoted me $25 for similar work, and that was using their fabric, not mine. I'm not trying to build a business that serves only wealthy customers. Emma explained, her confidence growing as she spoke about her professional philosophy. I want to serve families who need quality work at fair prices. Mrs. Peterson beamed with approval. Exactly what this community needs. Kate, you're looking at someone who will transform the options available to women throughout this region. As Kate scheduled her first fitting and left with obvious excitement about her wedding dress prospects, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The satisfaction of being genuinely needed and appreciated for her skills, rather than merely tolerated despite her limitations. One customer, Jacob, observed with satisfaction, his hands moving in gestures of celebration. But if Kate Morrison is pleased with your work, every ranching family within 50 miles will hear about it. Ranch women talk to each other across vast distances, and recommendations spread quickly. Emma looked around the workshop that Samuel had prepared for her, understanding now that it represented not just equipment and space, but a foundation for building the life she had dreamed of, independent, productive, and respected for her contributions rather than pitied for her struggles. He really believed I could succeed here, she said quietly, her voice carrying wonder at the depth of Samuel's faith in her potential. He knew you could succeed, Jacob corrected gently, his signs emphasizing the certainty behind his words. The question now is whether you're ready to prove him right. 3 weeks into her new life in Millfield, Emma had established a routine that brought her genuine satisfaction for the first time in years. Each morning she walked from the hotel to her workshop, greeting the townspeople who had begun to acknowledge her with increasing friendliness. Kate Morrison's wedding dress was taking shape beautifully, and word of Emma's skill and reasonable prices had begun to spread beyond the immediate area. But on this particular Tuesday morning, Emma knew something. was wrong the moment she approached the workshop door. The lock hung broken, dangling from splintered wood where someone had forced entry during the night. Her heart hammering, she pushed open the door to find devastation that took her breath away. The professional workspace Samuel had so carefully prepared was in ruins. Bolts of expensive fabric had been slashed with a knife, their contents spilling across the floor in ruined ribbons of silk and wool. The Singer sewing machine lay on its side, its delicate mechanisms damaged beyond repair. Spools of thread had been scattered everywhere, their contents tangled into impossible knots. But the most devastating sight was Kate Morrison's wedding dress, which had been nearly completed. The ivory silk hung from its dress form like a shroud, slashed and stained with what appeared to be lamp oil. Months of careful work, and her customer's precious family heirloom had been destroyed with calculated malice. Emma sank to her knees among the wreckage, tears streaming down her face as she surveyed the destruction of everything she had begun to build. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a deliberate attack designed to destroy her livelihood and drive her from Millfield. "Emma!" Jacob's voice called from the doorway, his usual controlled demeanor cracking as he took in the scene. His hands moved in sharp, angry gestures that needed no translation. They conveyed outrage, concern, and a determination to find whoever was responsible. Mrs. Peterson appeared behind him, her face going pale as she saw the extent of the damage. "Oh, dear Lord," she whispered. "Who would do such a thing?" Emma struggled to her feet, her hands shaking as she lifted a piece of destroyed silk. "Someone who wanted to make sure I couldn't stay in Millfield," she said, her stutter more pronounced. "In her distress, someone who knew exactly how to destroy everything I was building." Jacob moved through the workshop, his weathered face growing darker as he assessed the damage. "This wasn't done by drifters or opportunistic thieves," he said grimly. "Whoever did this knew exactly what would hurt you most." Before Emma could respond, hurried footsteps approached the workshop. Kate Morrison burst through the doorway, her face bright with excitement that immediately transformed to horror as she saw the destruction. "I came to see how the dress was," Kate's words died as she spotted the ruined silk hanging from the dress form. Her grandmother's precious fabric, the foundation of her wedding dreams, hung in oil-stained tatters. "Kate, I'm so sorry," Emma began, her voice breaking with the weight of her failure to protect her customer's trust. But Kate Morrison surprised her. Instead of anger or blame, the young woman's face filled with determination. "Who did this?" she demanded, her voice carrying an authority that suggested she was accustomed to taking charge in difficult situations. "We don't know yet," Jacob replied, his hands moving in frustrated gestures, "but we intend to find out." Mrs. Peterson was examining the broken lock with professional interest. "This wasn't picked or forced with tools," she observed. "Someone had a key or knew exactly how to bypass the mechanism." The implication sent a chill through Emma. Someone with access to keys, someone who knew the workshop's security measures, someone who belonged in Millfield enough to move freely at night without arousing suspicion. "Marshal Bradford needs to see this," Jacob said, his voice carrying grim determination. "This is destruction of property and theft, clear criminal activity." But as if summoned by his words, Marshal Bradford appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled rather than surprised. Behind him came Mrs. Hartwell and Miss Phillips, their faces showing what Emma could only describe as satisfied smugness. "Marshal," Jacob began, "we need to report." "I know why you're here," Marshal Bradford interrupted, his uncomfortable manner suggesting he was operating under instructions rather than his own judgment. Mrs. Hartwell reported seeing suspicious activity around this building last night. "We need to investigate whether Miss Sullivan has been storing stolen goods or operating without proper licenses." The accusation was so outrageous that Emma couldn't immediately process it. They were suggesting that she was the criminal, that The destruction of her workshop was somehow evidence of her own wrongdoing. That's ridiculous, Emma managed, her stutter making her protest sound weak and unconvincing. These are my materials, my equipment, my Kiki customers' property. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward with an expression of false concern. Marshal Bradford, I think you'll find that Miss Sullivan can't actually prove ownership of most of these expensive items. A woman of her circumstances couldn't possibly afford such elaborate equipment and materials. Miss Phillips nodded in agreement. It's quite suspicious that someone with no established income would suddenly possess thousands of dollars worth of professional equipment. Emma stared at them in disbelief. They had destroyed her workshop and were now using the destruction as evidence of criminal activity. The logic was twisted but effective. How could she prove ownership of equipment that had been damaged beyond recognition? I have deed documentation, Emma said desperately, reaching for the papers Jacob had shown her weeks earlier, but her hands came up empty. The cooperative charter and business records were nowhere to be found among the wreckage. What documentation? Marshal Bradford asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The papers Samuel prepared, Jacob said firmly. The cooperative charter, the business registration, the supplier receipts, everything was kept. In the desk drawer, Mrs. Peterson hurried to the overturned desk, searching through scattered papers and broken wood. They're gone, she said quietly. Every official document, every piece of legal proof. Emma felt the world spinning around her as the full scope of the attack became clear. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a carefully planned assault designed to destroy not only her equipment, but her legal right to operate in Millfield. Without proper documentation, Mrs. Hartwell said smoothly, I'm afraid Miss Sullivan's presence here becomes quite questionable. Perhaps it would be best if she returned to wherever she came from. But Kate Morrison stepped forward, her ranch-hardened voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Mrs. Hartwell, I've been doing business with Miss Sullivan for 3 weeks. I've seen her work, paid her deposits, and can vouch for her professional competence. That's very kind of you, Kate, Miss Phillips replied condescendingly, but a young woman's testimony hardly constitutes legal proof of business ownership. Emma watched her carefully built future crumble before her eyes. Without documentation, without equipment, without the proof of Samuel's arrangements, she had no way to defend herself against accusations designed to drive her from Millfield. But Jacob Mitchell stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. Marshal Bradford, I think you need to see something before you make any arrests or accusations. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper Emma had never seen before. Samuel gave me this 3 months ago with instructions to present it only if Miss Sullivan's legal status was ever questioned. Marshal Bradford accepted the document with obvious reluctance, his expression changing as he read its contents. This is a marriage certificate, he said slowly. Emma stared at Jacob in confusion. But Samuel and I never married. He died before I arrived. Jacob's hands moved in careful, deliberate gestures as he spoke. Samuel knew he was taking risks, working late at the church, dealing with the old wood-burning stove that had been giving him trouble. He prepared this certificate weeks ago and asked me to witness it, along with 2 other church members. Mrs. Peterson gasped as she understood the implications. You mean Samuel legally married Emma before she even arrived in Millfield? Proxy marriage, Jacob confirmed, his voice carrying deep emotion. Samuel Mitchell and Emma Sullivan were legally wed 3 weeks before the fire, with proper witnesses and territorial authorization. Miss Sullivan is Samuel's lawful widow, with full rights to his estate and business arrangements. The revelation hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Mrs. Hartwell's face went white as she realized the implications of what Jacob was revealing. Miss Phillips stepped backward, clearly understanding that their carefully planned attack had just backfired spectacularly. That means, Marshal Bradford said slowly, that Miss Sullivan has legal standing as Samuel Mitchell's widow. Any property or business arrangements he made are legally hers. Emma felt the world tilt around her as she grasped what Jacob was telling her. She wasn't just a mail-order bride who had arrived too late. She was Samuel Mitchell's legal widow, with all the rights and protections that status provided. Furthermore, Jacob continued, producing another document, Samuel prepared a complete inventory of everything he purchased for the workshop, with receipts and supplier documentation. I have copies of everything that was destroyed here tonight. Mrs. Hartwell's satisfied expression crumbled into panic as she realized the extent of her miscalculation. This is impossible. You can't simply declare someone married after the fact. Proxy marriages are legal in Montana Territory when properly witnessed and documented, Marshal Bradford confirmed, his professional demeanor returning. As he recognized the legitimate authority of the papers Jacob presented. Mrs. Mitchell, he paused, emphasizing Emma's new legal status, appears to have full legal standing in this community. Emma stared at Jacob, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had just learned. You mean Samuel and I were really married? Before he died? Jacob nodded, his weathered face softening with memory. He said he wanted to make sure you would be protected no matter what happened. He knew there were people who would try to use your circumstances against you. Kate Morrison stepped forward, her face blazing with determination. Mrs. Mitchell, whoever destroyed your workshop, committed crimes against a legal resident of Millfield. I demand they be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. As the reality of her situation sank in, Emma felt something she had never experienced before. The absolute security of knowing she belonged somewhere, protected by law and accepted by people who valued her for who she was, rather than pitying her for what she lacked. But more than that, she realized that Samuel Mitchell had given her the greatest gift possible, not just legal protection, but the knowledge that someone had believed in her completely enough to stake his reputation and resources on her success. The news of Emma's true status as Samuel Mitchell's widow spread through Millfield faster than wildfire across dry grass. By afternoon, a steady stream of townspeople had begun arriving at the destroyed workshop, not as curious onlookers, but as neighbors offering help, supplies, and support that Emma had never dared to hope for. The first to arrive was Thomas Murphy, the carpenter whose building housed Emma's workshop. He surveyed the damage with professional eyes, his weathered hands running along the broken doorframe and damaged walls. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, emphasizing her married name with deliberate respect, I've got seasoned lumber and hardware that can have this place secure again by tomorrow evening. No charge. Samuel was a good friend, and anyone who destroys a widow's livelihood in my building has answer to me. Behind him came his teenage son carrying an armload of tools, followed by two other men Emma recognized from Sunday services. Without waiting for permission, they began clearing debris and assessing what could be salvaged from the wreckage. Mrs. Peterson arrived with her arms full of fabric remnants and sewing supplies from her general store. It's not the quality of what was destroyed, she said apologetically, but it's enough to get you started again while we arrange for proper replacements. Emma stood in the center of the bustling activity, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of community support. These weren't people responding to charity cases or pity. They were neighbors helping one of their own rebuild after a devastating attack. I don't understand, Emma said to Jacob as they watched Thomas Murphy's crew work with efficient determination. Yesterday, I was an outsider they barely tolerated. Today they're treating me like family. Jacob's hands moved in expressive gestures while he spoke. Yesterday you were a stranger whose presence some people resented. Today you're Samuel Mitchell's widow, which makes you part of Millfield's history and future. That changes everything, Doctor. Elizabeth Chambers, a woman Emma had seen around town but never met, approached with a professional medical bag and a warm smile. She was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely grey hair and intelligent eyes that spoke of education and competence, unusual in frontier communities. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Chambers said, extending her hand in greeting, "I'm the physician here in Millfield. I wanted to introduce myself and discuss some opportunities that might interest you." Emma accepted the handshake with curiosity. "Opportunities? I've been the only medical practitioner in this region for 2 years," Dr. Chambers explained, "and I've learned that healing requires more than just medical knowledge. Many of my patients need clothing adaptations for injuries or disabilities, sleeves that accommodate bandaged arms, skirts that allow for leg braces, undergarments that don't irritate surgical sites." The concept intrigued Emma immediately. Adaptive clothing for medical needs? Exactly. There's a real need for someone with your skills to work with medical requirements. The pay would be excellent, and the work would serve people who truly need specialized services. Jacob nodded approvingly at the suggestion. Samuel would have loved that idea, using practical skills to help people in genuine need. As Dr. Chambers explained the potential collaboration, Emma felt excitement building in her chest. This wasn't just about rebuilding her destroyed workshop. It was about expanding her purpose beyond simple dressmaking into something that could genuinely improve people's lives. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group Emma hadn't expected to see. Ranching families from throughout the valley, led by Kate Morrison and her fiancé, a tall, quiet man named David Chen, whose mixed heritage reflected the diverse communities scattered across Montana Territory. "Mrs. Mitchell," Kate announced, with the authority of someone accustomed to organizing community efforts, "we've been talking among the ranch families, and we have a proposition for you." David Chen stepped forward, his manner respectful but determined. "Ma'am, the nearest reliable seamstress services are in Helena, 3 days' ride away. The women in our families have been making do with mail-order clothes that don't fit properly or wearing things out because we can't get them repaired professionally." "What David's trying to say," Kate continued with a smile, "is that we need you more than you need us. We're prepared to place orders that would keep you busy for months, with payment in advance to help you rebuild your equipment and inventory." Emma stared at them in amazement. "You would trust me with that much work, even after what happened to your wedding dress?" Kate's expression grew fierce with determination. "Mrs. Mitchell, whoever destroyed your workshop also destroyed my dress, out of pure spite. That tells me everything I need to know about them and everything I need to know about you. Anyone they hate that much must be worth supporting." David Chen nodded in agreement. "We've already spoken with families from the Morrison Ranch, the Circle Bar, the Double Diamond, and 5 smaller spreads. Between us, we can provide enough steady work to support a thriving business." Mrs. Peterson approached with obvious excitement. "Emma, this could be the foundation for something much larger than we originally envisioned. With regular customers providing steady income, you could expand to serve communities throughout the territory." As Emma listened to their plans and offers of support, she realized that the attack on her workshop had accomplished the opposite of what her enemies intended. Instead of driving her away, it had galvanized the community's support and revealed opportunities she had never imagined. But the afternoon's most surprising visitor was yet to come. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Main Street, a familiar figure approached the workshop, Mrs. Hartwell, walking alone and looking thoroughly defeated. The bustling activity ceased as townspeople noticed her arrival. Thomas Murphy straightened from his repair work, his expression hardening with obvious disapproval. Kate Morrison moved protectively closer to Emma, her stance suggesting readiness for confrontation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly, her previous arrogance replaced by something that might have been shame. I've come to apologize." Emma stared at her in shock. This was the woman who had tried to drive her from Millfield, who had orchestrated legal challenges and social ostracism, who had clearly been involved in the destruction of her workshop. "Apologize?" Emma's voice carried disbelief rather than acceptance. Mrs. Hartwell's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing genuine distress beneath her usual controlled demeanor. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Mitchell. Terribly, inexcusably wrong." Jacob stepped forward, his weathered face skeptical. "What changed your mind, Mrs. Hartwell? Yesterday you were determined to drive Emma out of town." "Yesterday I thought I was protecting our community from an opportunistic stranger," Mrs. Hartwell replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Today I learned that my actions destroyed the property of Samuel Mitchell's lawful widow, a woman who had every right to be here, who brought skills our community desperately needs." Kate Morrison's voice carried sharp suspicion. "And who told you about the workshop destruction, Mrs. Hartwell? Who gave you the idea that attacking Emma's livelihood would be effective?" Mrs. Hartwell's face crumbled entirely at the question. "My nephew," she admitted with obvious pain. "Dennis Phillips, Miss Phillips' brother. He convinced me that Miss Sullivan, Mrs. Mitchell, was a threat to our community's moral standards." The revelation sent murmurs through the gathered crowd. Emma remembered Miss Phillips as one of her most vocal critics, but she hadn't known about the family connection or the deliberate campaign to destroy her prospects. "Dennis told me he had proof that Mrs. Mitchell was involved in fraudulent business arrangements," Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice growing stronger as she made her confession. "He said the only way to protect our town was to make it impossible for her to establish herself here." Dr. Chambers frowned with obvious concern. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you saying that Dennis Phillips orchestrated the attack on Mrs. Mitchell's workshop?" "I didn't know about the attack until this morning," Mrs. Hartwell said quickly. "When I saw the destruction, I realized how far Dennis had taken his campaign. That's when I started asking questions and learned the truth about Mrs. Mitchell's legal status." Emma found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. "Why tell us this now? Why risk exposing your nephew's actions?" Mrs. Hartwell looked directly at Emma for the first time since arriving, her eyes reflecting genuine remorse. "Because I've spent the day watching this community rally around you, Mrs. Mitchell. Watching people I've known for years work together to help you rebuild. I realized that my nephew and I were wrong about everything, about you, about what our community needs, about what Samuel Mitchell would have wanted." Thomas Murphy stepped forward, his carpenter's tools still in his hands. "Mrs. Hartwell, if your nephew committed criminal acts against Mrs. Mitchell's property, he needs to face the consequences of those actions." "I know," Mrs. Hartwell replied quietly. "I've already spoken with Marshal Bradford. Dennis will be arrested tonight, along with anyone else who participated in destroying Mrs. Mitchell's workshop." The promise of justice felt less important to Emma than the recognition in Mrs. Hartwell's eyes, the acknowledgement that she belonged in Millfield not as a tolerated outsider, but as a valued member of the community. "Mrs. Hartwell," Emma said carefully, "I appreciate your apology, but words alone can't repair what was destroyed or undo the harm that was caused." "I know that," Mrs. Hartwell replied, "which is why I'm prepared to make financial restitution for the damages and to publicly support your business enterprises going forward." Kate Morrison exchanged glances with David Chen before speaking. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think Mrs. Hartwell's offer of support could be valuable. She has connections throughout the territory that could bring you customers from communities we can't reach." As darkness fell over Millfield, Emma stood in her partially rebuilt workshop, surrounded by neighbors who had become allies, facing a future that looked brighter than anything she had dared to imagine when she stepped off the train weeks earlier. She was no longer Emma Sullivan. the desperate mail-order bride with a stutter. She was Emma Mitchell, Samuel's widow, a respected businesswoman with a community that valued her contributions and protected her interests. Most importantly, she had discovered that belonging wasn't something to be granted by others. It was something to be claimed through courage, perseverance, and the willingness to prove one's worth through actions rather than words. The arrest of Dennis Phillips and his accomplices sent shockwaves through Millfield that reverberated far beyond the immediate crime. When Marshal Bradford led Phillips away in shackles 3 days after the workshop attack, a crowd had gathered outside the jail, not to protest the arrest, but to ensure justice was properly served for the attack on one of their own. Emma watched from her hotel window as Phillips was loaded into the prison wagon bound for the territorial courthouse in Helena. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of her livelihood looked smaller and more pathetic than she had imagined, his elaborate schemes reduced to petty vandalism and criminal conspiracy. "Good riddance," Mrs. Peterson said firmly, joining Emma at the window. That boy always had more ambition than sense, and more cruelty than either. The legal proceedings had moved with surprising speed. Judge Sterling, the same territorial judge who had initially questioned Emma's rights in Millfield, had returned to oversee the criminal case. His investigation revealed that Phillips had recruited 2 drifters to actually carry out the workshop destruction, paying them with money stolen from his sister's savings account. 20 years in territorial prison, Jacob reported when he returned from the courthouse proceedings, his hands moving in gestures of satisfied justice. The judge said that attacking a widow's livelihood was among the most despicable crimes he'd ever prosecuted, but Phillips' conviction brought an unexpected consequence that no one had anticipated. During his confession, seeking to reduce his sentence, Phillips had revealed information about a larger conspiracy involving territorial land speculators who had been targeting successful small businesses throughout Montana. They wanted to drive out independent operators and buy up commercial properties at reduced prices, Dr. Chambers explained as she helped Emma organize her rebuilt workshop. Phillips thought he was protecting Millfield's social standards, but he was actually working for outside interests who wanted to control our community's economic development. The revelation transformed local understanding of what had happened to Emma. She hadn't been targeted because of personal prejudice or social snobbery. She had been attacked because her potential success threatened a coordinated effort to suppress local business development, which means, Kate Morrison observed with grim satisfaction, that every business owner in Millfield has a stake in ensuring your success. You're not just a seamstress anymore. You're a symbol of our community's independence. Emma found this newfound symbolic status both gratifying and overwhelming. When she walked down Main Street, people nodded with respect rather than curiosity. When she entered Peterson's general store, other customers asked her opinion about fabric choices and sewing techniques. When she attended Sunday services at the temporary chapel set up in the schoolhouse, families invited her to join them for dinner. But the most significant change in her daily routine was Jacob Mitchell's constant presence. What had begun as his uncle's obligation to ensure her welfare had evolved into something neither of them had expected, a genuine partnership that extended far beyond business arrangements or family duty. "You don't have to check on me every day," Emma told him as he arrived at her workshop for the 5th consecutive morning, carrying coffee and fresh bread from the hotel kitchen. Jacob's weathered face showed a slight flush as his hands moved in. Careful gestures. "I know I don't have to," he said quietly. "I want to. If that makes you uncomfortable, I can—" "It doesn't make me uncomfortable," Emma interrupted, surprised by her own directness. "I just don't want you to feel obligated because of Samuel's arrangements." Jacob set down the coffee and bread, his brown eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Emma, Nothing I'm doing now has anything to do with obligation. To Samuel, everything I'm doing has to do with how I feel about you. The admission hung in the air between them like morning mist, fragile and transformative. Emma stared at Jacob, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as Samuel's uncle or her protector, but as a man whose quiet strength and patient kindness had become essential to her daily happiness. "Jacob," she said softly, "I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this might become. Samuel and I were never really married in any meaningful way, but legally, I'm still his widow. It feels complicated," Jacob finished, his hands moving. "In understanding gestures, I know, but Emma, Samuel would want you to be happy. He wouldn't want his memory to prevent you from building a real future with someone who truly knows and cares for you." Before Emma could respond, the workshop door opened to admit an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 30s entered, well-dressed, but travel-worn, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the exhausted demeanor of someone who had been riding hard for days. "Are you Mrs. Emma Mitchell?" the stranger asked without preamble. "Yes," Emma replied cautiously, wondering what new complication was about to enter her increasingly complex life. The woman extended a gloved hand in greeting. "I'm Catherine Reed, attorney for the Territorial Women's Business Association. I've traveled from Helena specifically to meet with you about your business cooperative and the legal challenges you've overcome." Emma exchanged puzzled glances with Jacob. "I'm not sure I understand. What business association?" Catherine Reed smiled for the first time since entering the workshop. "Mrs. Mitchell, your case has become famous throughout Montana Territory. A woman arriving alone, establishing legal business rights through an innovative cooperative structure, surviving coordinated attacks from land speculators, and building community support that led to criminal convictions. You've become a symbol of what women can achieve when they have proper legal protection." The idea that her struggles in Millfield had attracted territorial attention was both flattering and alarming. "What does the association want from me?" "We want to learn from your experience," Catherine Reed explained, settling into a chair and opening a leather portfolio. "The cooperative structure Samuel Mitchell created for you is unprecedented in territorial law. We believe it could be adapted to help women throughout Montana establish themselves in business with legal protections that can't be easily challenged." Jacob leaned forward with obvious interest. "You're talking about replicating Emma's situation for other women?" "Exactly. We've identified dozens of women throughout the territory who have skills and ambition, but lack the legal framework to establish themselves securely. Your cooperative model could provide that framework." Emma felt a thrill of excitement at the possibility. "You mean other women could have the same protections Samuel created for me?" "Better protections," Catherine Reed confirmed. "We've been studying the legal documents your husband prepared, and we believe we can strengthen and expand them into a territorial standard for women's business enterprises." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Catherine Reed explaining the association's vision for expanding women's economic opportunities throughout Montana Territory. They wanted Emma to serve as a founding advisor, helping other women navigate the legal and practical challenges of establishing independent businesses. "There would be compensation for your advisory services," Catherine Reed explained, "but more importantly, there would be the satisfaction of knowing that your struggles paved the way for other women to achieve similar success with less difficulty." After Catherine Reed departed with promises to return within a month with formal proposals, Emma found herself alone with Jacob in the workshop that had become the center of her new life. The sewing machine hummed quietly as she worked on Dr. Chambers' latest commission, adaptive clothing for a patient recovering from a mining accident. "How do you feel about becoming famous throughout the territory?" Jacob asked, his hands moving in teasing gestures. Emma laughed, a sound of genuine joy that would have been impossible during her first desperate weeks in Millfield. "I feel like I'm finally becoming the person Samuel believed I could be, even though I never got the chance to know him properly." Jacob moved closer, his weathered features softening with emotion. "Emma, I think Samuel knew exactly what he was doing when he made all those arrangements for you. He wasn't just preparing for a marriage, he was preparing for you to discover your own strength and potential." "And what about you?" Emma asked quietly. "What are you preparing for?" Jacob's hands stilled as he considered her question. When he spoke, his voice carried deep sincerity. "I'm preparing to ask if you might consider a future that includes more than just business partnerships and community obligations." Emma set down her sewing and turned to face him fully. "Jacob Mitchell, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider the possibility," Jacob replied, his hands moving in gestures of hope and uncertainty. "Not because of anything Samuel arranged, not because of legal obligations or community expectations, but because I've fallen in love with your courage, your kindness, and your determination to build something meaningful despite every obstacle that's been placed in your path." Emma looked into his brown eyes, seeing not just affection, but genuine respect and admiration. This man had watched her struggle, supported her through crises, and celebrated her victories. He had learned to communicate with her through sign language and patience when her stutter made speech difficult. Most importantly, he had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to love not just her strengths, but her struggles as well. "Yes," Emma said clearly, her stutter completely absent. In this moment of perfect certainty, "Yes, I would very much like to consider that possibility." As Jacob's face lit up with joy and he took her hands in his weathered ones, Emma realized that her journey to Millfield had brought her something she had never dared to hope for, not just acceptance or security, but genuine love based on mutual respect and shared dreams for the future. The sound of hammers and saws had become the soundtrack of Millfield's transformation. 6 months after the fire that destroyed St. Mary's Chapel, the entire community had rallied to build something unprecedented, not just a replacement church, but a community center that would serve multiple congregations and civic functions. Emma stood at her workshop window, watching the construction crew raise the final wall beam of the new building. The structure was larger than the original chapel, designed with multiple rooms that could accommodate different religious services, town meetings, and community gatherings. Most remarkably, it included features that made it accessible to people with various disabilities: wide doorways for wheelchairs, excellent lighting for those with vision difficulties, and an innovative acoustic design that would help people with hearing impairments participate fully in services. "Your influence," Dr. Chambers observed, joining Emma at the window. 6 months ago, this community barely acknowledged that people with disabilities had special needs. Now they're building a church that welcomes everyone. Emma shook her head modestly. "It wasn't my idea. Jacob suggested the accessibility features when the planning committee asked for input. Jacob suggested them because living with you taught him to notice things he'd never considered before," Dr. Chambers replied with a knowing smile. "The way you've navigated your speech difficulties, the patience you've shown with customers who struggle to communicate, the adaptations you've created for my patients, all of it has opened people's eyes to possibilities they'd never imagined." The conversation was interrupted by Kate Morrison, who burst through the workshop door with her characteristic energy. Her wedding dress, recreated from new silk after the destruction of the original, hung nearby in its completed glory, more beautiful than what had been destroyed. "Emma!" Kate exclaimed, her face glowing with excitement. "You need to see what's happening at the church site. They're installing the sign, and you're going to love what it says." Emma followed Kate outside, along with Dr. Chambers and several other women who had gathered to discuss the upcoming dedication ceremony. As they approached the construction site, Emma could see Thomas Murphy and his crew carefully positioning. A wooden sign above the main entrance. The sign read, "Millfield Community Church and Center, founded in memory of Pastor Samuel Mitchell, dedicated to the principle that all God's children deserve welcome and opportunity." 1876. But it was the smaller plaque being installed beside the main entrance that took Emma's breath away. The Samuel and Emma Mitchell Fellowship Hall, where community builds strength through unity. Emma stared at the dedication plaque, tears filling her eyes as she realized the community had chosen to honor both her and Samuel as founders of something that would serve Millfield for generations to come. Jacob approached from the construction site, his work clothes dusty from the day's labor, his weathered face bright with satisfaction. "What do you think?" he asked, his hands moving in proud gestures toward the nearly completed building. "It's beautiful," Emma managed, her voice thick with emotion. "But Jacob, I don't deserve to have my name on a fellowship hall. I've only been here 6 months. 6 months during which you've transformed this community more than most people do in a lifetime," Thomas Murphy called from his position overseeing the sign installation. "Mrs. Mitchell, that fellowship hall exists because you showed us what it means to build something that serves everyone, not just the people who were here first." Mrs. Peterson approached with an armload of fabric samples, her face beaming with excitement. "Emma, dear, we need to discuss your dress for the church dedication ceremony. Since you and Jacob have decided to renew your vows in the new church, we want to make sure you have something truly special." The plan for the vow renewal had evolved naturally from conversations about the church dedication. Since Emma and Samuel had been married by proxy, never having the opportunity to exchange vows in person, and since her relationship with Jacob had deepened into genuine love, the community had suggested that she and Jacob formally wed in the new church as part of its consecration ceremony. "It feels right," Jacob had explained when they first discussed the idea. "Samuel brought you to Millfield, but our love grew from our own choices and experiences. A new wedding in the new church would honor his memory while celebrating our actual partnership." Emma had been nervous about the community attention such a ceremony would attract, but Dr. Chambers had made an observation that changed her perspective entirely. "Emma, your wedding will be the first ceremony in that church. Couples will be exchanging vows there for decades to come, and they'll all be following a precedent you and Jacob establish. Make it something that celebrates what marriage can be at its best." Now, as she looked at the nearly completed church that would host her wedding in just 2 weeks, Emma felt a mixture of excitement and responsibility. This wouldn't just be her wedding, it would be a community celebration and a statement about Millfield's values and future direction. Catherine Reed, the territorial attorney, had returned to Millfield with a delegation from the Women's Business Association, bringing news that Emma's cooperative model was being implemented in communities. Throughout Montana Territory, 5 women had already established businesses using legal frameworks based on Samuel's innovative structure. "You've started something that will outlast all of us," Catherine had told Emma during their latest meeting. "Women throughout the territory are gaining economic independence because of the legal precedents established here in Millfield. But perhaps the most significant change was in Emma herself. The stammering, desperate woman who had stepped off the train 6 months earlier had been replaced by someone who spoke with confidence, managed a thriving business, and commanded respect throughout the community. Her stutter had largely disappeared, except during moments of extreme emotion, and even then it seemed more like a charming quirk than a disability. "Mrs. Mitchell," a young voice called from across the construction site. Emma turned to see Jenny Murphy, Thomas Murphy's 12-year-old daughter, approaching with obvious excitement. "Yes, Jenny? Pa said I could ask you something special." Jenny said, her face bright with hope. "Could you teach me to sew? I mean really sew, like you do? I want to learn to make beautiful things that help people." Emma felt her heart swell with pride and affection. "Of course, Jenny, but why do you want to learn?" Jenny's answer revealed the depth of Emma's influence on Millfield's younger generation. "Because you showed me that a lady can have her own business and help people and be important in her community. I want to be important like you." As Emma agreed to take Jenny as her first apprentice, she realized that her impact on Millfield extended beyond her immediate business success. She had become a role model for young women who were seeing new possibilities for their own futures. The day before the church dedication and wedding ceremony, Emma received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hartwell arrived at the workshop carrying a carefully wrapped package, her manner humble and respectful, a complete transformation from the hostile woman who had tried to drive Emma from town. "Mrs. Mitchell," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly, "I've brought you a wedding gift. It belonged to my grandmother, and I'd like you to have it for your ceremony tomorrow." Emma unwrapped the package to reveal an exquisite lace veil, handmade with incredible skill and obviously treasured for generations. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is beautiful, but I couldn't possibly accept something so precious." "Please," Mrs. Hartwell insisted, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Let me do this one thing to make amends for the harm I caused. My grandmother would have loved knowing that her veil was worn by a woman who built something meaningful, despite facing opposition and hardship." Emma accepted the veil with gratitude, understanding that Mrs. Hartwell's gesture represented complete acceptance and genuine respect. The woman who had once viewed her as a threat now saw her as someone worthy of family heirlooms and community honor. That evening, as Emma sat in her workshop putting finishing touches on her wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk and delicate embroidery that showcased all her skills, Jacob arrived with a final gift from Samuel's estate. "I found this among Samuel's papers," Jacob explained, his hands moving in gentle gestures as he presented a small leather journal. "He started writing it after your first letter, recording his thoughts about your correspondence and his hopes for your future together." Emma opened the journal with trembling fingers, reading Samuel's careful handwriting as he documented his growing affection for a woman he knew only through letters, his excitement about her professional skills, and his determination to create a foundation for her success regardless of what happened to their personal relationship. The final entry, written just days before his death, brought tears to her eyes. "Emma Sullivan will arrive in Millfield tomorrow, and I pray she will find not just a husband, but a community that recognizes her worth and potential. If anything happens to me, I trust that she will still find the life she deserves, surrounded by people who value her contributions and celebrate her achievements." As Emma prepared for sleep on the eve of her wedding, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate circumstances in Philadelphia to respected leadership in a thriving Montana community. Tomorrow, she would marry Jacob Mitchell, not out of obligation or convenience, but from genuine love built on mutual respect and shared dreams. Most importantly, she would do so as Emma Mitchell, successful businesswoman, community leader, and woman who had discovered that belonging wasn't something to be granted by others, but something to be claimed through courage, perseverance, and the willingness to build something meaningful despite every obstacle placed in one's path. The morning of the church dedication dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming across the mountains and painting Millfield in shades of gold and amber. Emma stood before the mirror in her hotel room, wearing the ivory silk wedding dress she had created with her own hands, Mrs. Hartwell's ancestral lace veil flowing around her shoulders like a blessing from previous generations. Dr. Chambers had arrived early to help with final preparations, her skilled hands arranging the veil and adjusting the dress's intricate embroidery. "You look absolutely radiant," she said warmly. "Samuel would be so proud to see what you've become." Emma touched the small silver locket at her throat, a gift from Jacob containing a photograph of Samuel that had been taken just weeks before. His death. "I hope so. Sometimes I feel like I'm living a life he made possible, but I never got to thank him for it." "You're thanking him by living it well," Dr. Chambers replied gently. "By building something meaningful from the foundation. He provided by helping other women achieve similar success, by showing this community what it means to welcome and support newcomers." Through the window, Emma could see townspeople streaming toward the new church from every direction. Families from ranches throughout the valley had traveled for hours to attend the dedication ceremony and witness the wedding that would consecrate the building with its first sacrament. Even people who had initially opposed her presence in Millfield were arriving with obvious anticipation for the celebration. Mrs. Peterson entered, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the mountain meadows surrounding the town. "From the women of Millfield," she announced with obvious pride. "Every flower was picked by someone whose life you've touched in the past 6 months. The bouquet was beautiful in its simplicity. Mountain lupines, Indian paintbrush, wild roses and delicate grasses arranged with the same careful attention Emma brought to her finest needlework. Each bloom represented a relationship she had built, a customer she had served, a friend she had gained through perseverance and genuine care for others. Kate Morrison arrived in her own wedding dress, the recreation Emma had made after the original was destroyed. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said formally, then broke into a grin. "Emma, I wanted to thank you one more time before the ceremony. Not just for the dress, but for showing me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." "You stood up for me when I needed it most," Emma replied, her voice steady and clear. "I should be thanking you." "We stood up for each other," Kate corrected. "That's what communities do when they're working properly." As the women prepared to walk to the church, Emma felt a profound sense of completion. The desperate, stammering woman who had arrived in Millfield 6 months earlier had been transformed not just by circumstances, but by the discovery of her own strength and the support of people who had chosen to see her potential rather than her limitations. The new Millfield Community Church was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only and overflow crowds gathered outside the windows. The building itself was a testament to what the community had become: accessible, welcoming, designed to serve everyone rather than excluding those who didn't fit traditional expectations. Jacob waited at the altar, resplendent in his finest suit, his weathered face bright with joy and love. Beside him stood Reverend William Hayes, the new pastor who had been called to serve Millfield's growing congregation. But most significantly, Thomas Murphy stood ready to serve as sign language interpreter, ensuring that every word of the ceremony would be accessible to all members of the community. As Emma walked down the aisle, her hand resting on Mrs. Peterson's arm, she saw faces that told the story of her transformation from outsider to beloved community member. Mrs. Whitman from the hotel beamed with maternal pride. Jenny Murphy watched with rapt attention, seeing her mentor and role model embrace her future. Even Mrs. Hartwell wiped tears from her eyes, her presence a testament to the power of forgiveness and redemption. But it was Jacob's face that held Emma's attention as she approached the altar. His brown eyes reflected not just love, but deep respect and admiration for the woman she had become. This wasn't a marriage of convenience or desperation. It was a union between equals who had chosen each other based on genuine affection and shared dreams. Reverend Hayes began the ceremony with words that acknowledged the unique circumstances that had brought them together. "We gather today to witness the marriage of Jacob Mitchell and Emma Mitchell, two souls who found each other. Through tragedy and built love, through mutual respect, shared struggle and common purpose. As they exchanged vows, Emma's voice rang clear and strong throughout the church, her stutter completely absent, as she spoke the words that would bind her to Jacob. "I promise to stand beside you as your equal partner, to build with you something meaningful that serves our community, and to love you not despite our differences, but because of them." Jacob's response, delivered simultaneously in spoken words and sign language, brought tears to many eyes. "I promise to see you always as the strong, capable woman you are, to support your dreams and ambitions, and to create with you a future that honors both Samuel's memory and our own love." When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in celebration that could be heard throughout Millfield. But the most meaningful moment came when Jacob and Emma turned to face their community, and the entire congregation began signing Amen in the sign language that had become a symbol of Millfield's commitment to inclusion and understanding. The reception that followed was held in the church's fellowship hall, the room dedicated to Samuel and Emma's memory. Tables groaned under dishes brought by families from throughout the valley, and the celebration continued late into the evening with music, dancing and storytelling that wove Emma's journey into the larger narrative of Millfield's growth and development. Catherine Reed, who had traveled from Helena specifically for the wedding, announced that the Women's Business Association had voted to establish its territorial headquarters in Millfield, with Emma serving as founding director. "This community has proven that economic opportunity and social justice can work together to create something beautiful," she declared. "We want to build on that foundation." As the evening celebration wound down, Emma and Jacob stood together on the church steps, looking out over the town that had become their home. The mountains rose around them like protective walls, and the lights in windows throughout Millfield spoke of families settling in for the night, secure in their community, and hopeful about their future. "What are you thinking?" Jacob asked, his hands moving in the gentle gestures that had become their private language of love. Emma considered the question, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate circumstances in Philadelphia to respected leadership in a thriving Montana community. "I'm thinking about Samuel," she said finally, "about how he created the possibility for this moment without ever knowing if it would actually happen." "He believed in you before he ever met you," Jacob replied. "That's the kind of faith that he changes the world." As they walked home together through the quiet streets of Millfield, Emma understood that her story was really about something much larger than one woman's struggle to find belonging. It was about communities learning to see potential rather than problems, about the power of inclusion over exclusion, about building something meaningful together rather than protecting what already existed. The mail-order bride with a stutter, who had found a burned church and a proxy husband, had become Emma Mitchell, businesswoman, community leader, and living proof that worth isn't determined by circumstances or origin, but by the courage to claim one's place in the world and the wisdom to build something beautiful from whatever materials life provides. Above them, stars filled the Montana sky with infinite possibility, and the future stretched ahead, like an unwritten story, waiting to be created by people brave enough to dream beyond their limitations and generous enough to lift others as they climbed toward their own success. In Millfield, Montana, the church bells would ring again, not just to mark the hours, but to celebrate a community that had learned the most important lesson of all, that true prosperity comes not from protecting what we have, but from sharing what we can become. 2 years later, Emma Mitchell stood in the expanded wing of her workshop, supervising 3 apprentices as they worked on commissions that would be shipped to customers across the Montana Territory and beyond. The sound of sewing machines hummed alongside animated conversations between the young women who had come to Millfield specifically to learn from the woman who had revolutionized opportunities for working women throughout the region. Jenny Murphy, now 14 and Emma's most advanced student, was carefully fitting a riding habit for the daughter of a Helena banker. Beside her, Mary Chen, David Chen's younger sister, worked on adaptive clothing designs that had become Emma's specialty and most profitable service line. The third apprentice, Sarah Whitman, Mrs. Whitman's niece from back east, focused on the intricate embroidery work that had made Millfield garments famous throughout the territory. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jenny called out, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her calling early in life. "The territorial governor's wife has requested 6 evening gowns for the upcoming statehood celebrations. She specifically asked for your signature design work." Emma smiled as she reviewed the commission details. Montana's impending statehood had brought unprecedented attention to communities like Millfield, and her business had grown far beyond anything Samuel could have imagined when he first prepared that workshop space behind Murphy's carpentry. The expanded workshop now occupied 3 buildings on Main Street, with specialized areas for different types of garments, a consultation room where customers could discuss their needs privately, and a small apartment above the main workspace where visiting customers could stay while having extensive work completed. But the most significant change was the sign hanging outside the main entrance. Mitchell and Associates, Territorial Headquarters, Women's Business Cooperative, serving communities throughout Montana since 1876. Apprenticeships available for qualified young women. Jacob entered through the workshop's front door, his arrival causing the usual flutter of excitement among the apprentices who had developed protective affection for their mentor's husband. He carried a thick envelope with official territorial seals, correspondence that had become routine as Emma's influence expanded beyond local business into territorial policy discussions. "More invitations," Jacob announced, his hands moving, in the fluid sign language that had become second nature throughout Millfield. "The territorial legislature wants your testimony about women's economic development programs, and the University of Montana is requesting your participation in their new business curriculum." Emma accepted the correspondence with mixed feelings. Recognition and influence brought opportunities to help other women, but they also pulled her away from the hands-on work she loved and the community that had nurtured her growth. "There's something else," Jacob continued, his expression growing more serious. "A letter from Philadelphia about your former employer." Emma's heart skipped as she opened the envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Philadelphia Inquirer, along with a letter from a woman she barely remembered, a fellow seamstress from the textile mill where Emma had worked before coming to Montana. The newspaper article described the bankruptcy and closure of Hartman Textiles, the company that had dismissed Emma for her speech difficulties. But more shocking was the revelation that company managers had been systematically discriminating against workers with disabilities, dismissing them without cause, and denying them fair wages for years before Emma's departure. The letter from her former colleague was more personal. "Dear Emma, I hope this letter finds you well in your new life out west. I wanted you to know that your courage in leaving Philadelphia and building something better has inspired many of us who stayed behind. We've organized a workers' committee to demand fair treatment for all employees, regardless of speech or other challenges. The newspaper article about your success in Montana has given us hope that change is possible even in established places like Philadelphia. Thank you for showing us what's possible when someone refuses to accept limitations others try to impose." Emma set down the letter with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the realization that her personal journey had somehow inspired people she'd never expected to reach. The desperate woman who had fled Philadelphia to escape impossible circumstances had unknowingly become a symbol of possibility for others facing similar challenges. "Good news?" Jacob asked gently, noting her emotional response. "Life-changing news," Emma replied, her voice thick with emotion. "People I worked with in Philadelphia are using my story to fight for better treatment of workers with disabilities. I never imagined that leaving would help the people I left behind." Dr. Chambers arrived for their weekly meeting about the medical adaptive clothing program, bringing news that would expand Emma's impact even further. "Emma, I've received inquiries from physicians in 7 different territories about your adaptive clothing designs. They want to establish similar programs in their communities." The medical clothing program had grown from Dr. Chambers' initial suggestion into a comprehensive service that created specialized garments for people recovering from injuries, living with chronic conditions, or managing permanent disabilities. Emma's designs had solved problems that conventional clothing manufacturers had never considered, creating garments that restored dignity and independence to people who had been marginalized by their circumstances. "We could train seamstresses in other communities," Emma suggested, her mind already working through the logistics. "Create a network of businesses that serve people with specialized needs while providing employment for women who want to learn these skills." "Exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Dr. Chambers replied with satisfaction. "I've already contacted medical colleagues in Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco. They're eager to implement similar programs." As the afternoon progressed, Emma found herself reviewing correspondence from customers, apprenticeship applicants, and officials throughout the territory who sought her advice on women's economic development initiatives. Each letter represented an opportunity to extend the principles she had learned in Millfield, that communities prospered when they welcomed talent regardless of its source, that businesses succeeded when they served real needs rather than artificial limitations, and that individual success multiplied when it lifted others towards similar achievements. The day's final visitor was Catherine Reed, the territorial attorney who had first recognized the broader significance of Emma's cooperative business model. She brought news that the Women's Business Association had been instrumental in passing territorial legislation that protected women's right to establish and operate independent businesses. 23 women have established successful businesses using the legal framework Samuel created for you, Catherine reported with obvious pride. But more importantly, the territorial legislature has adopted cooperative business structures as a standard option for any entrepreneur who wants to establish community-supported ventures. As evening approached and the workshop quieted, Emma and Jacob walked through Millfield's transformed streets. The town had grown substantially, with new businesses, a proper school building, and residential areas that housed families drawn by the community's reputation for welcoming newcomers and supporting innovation. The rebuilt church remained the heart of the community, but it was no longer the only gathering place. The fellowship hall hosted weekly meetings of the Women's Business Association, educational lectures, and social events that brought together people from ranches and mines throughout the valley. "Sometimes I can barely remember the woman who stepped off that train," Emma confessed, as they paused in front of the hotel where she had spent her first uncertain nights in Millfield. "I remember her," Jacob replied, his hands moving in gestures of deep affection. "She was brave enough to travel across the continent for a chance at something better, strong enough to rebuild when everything was destroyed, and generous enough to use her success to help others achieve similar dreams." Emma looked around at the community that had become not just her home, but her life's work. A place where her stutter had become irrelevant, her skills had found their purpose, and her struggles had been transformed into strength that could support others facing similar challenges. The mail-order bride, who had found a burned church and a proxy marriage, had discovered something far more valuable than security or acceptance. She had found her true calling as someone who could build bridges between possibility and achievement, who could transform personal pain into community strength, and who could prove that worth is determined not by the circumstances that shape us, but by what we choose to build from whatever materials life provides. Above them, the Montana skies stretched endless and bright with stars, and the future reached horizons that seemed to expand with every dream brave enough to claim its place among them. In Millfield, Montana, the bells of the community church rang out across the valley, not just marking time, but celebrating the eternal truth that transformation is always possible for those with courage enough to claim it and generosity enough to share it with others who are still searching for their own way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.